So aloha everyone. That is my background is the University of Hawaii. Maraming salamat sa very good introduction, Kristen. And I wanted to say, I think good afternoon to everyone. And I'm sorry about my lighting. It's actually 10 p.m. here in Hawaii, where I am now. So, so if I'm a little sleepy, then it's you can understand why. But anyway, thanks very much to our dear friends at the Ateneo, especially Kristen, for that wonderful introduction. I really miss Ateneo, and I'm really happy to be with all of you again here, even virtually. So it's always a pleasure to give a talk at the Ateneo and to talk about my work. It's actually a really good feeling that even though this work is more than 10 years old, that people still ask me to talk about the women of the rebellion, and it could still be relevant and it could still speak to us, especially as it relates very well to the themes of the lecture series. As Kirsten said earlier, the theme of Ateneo's lecture series this year is disruptions and reclamations, which is particularly relevant as we deal with many disruptions caused by the pandemic and the political events at home, there, and abroad. Philippine history, as she said, is full of disruptions from the colonial to the revolutionary periods to post colonial authoritarian regimes to the contemporary period. While these episodes in our history are well known and usually feature the men who make history, what is often lacking in such rich chronologies are the women and their own experiences, struggles, and legacy. Despite recent advances in Philippine history, women continue to be seen as footnotes or still merely as metaphors to discuss change and continuity in Philippine society. So, focusing on my own work on the women of the Hook Rebellion, this lecture will place women at the center of the Philippines' history of disruptions and reclamations. But I will highlight the Filipinas who disrupted convention and the status quo. These women who, during the Spanish colonial period, entered beateries to get an education, constantly challenged religious authorities, worked in cigar factories, and even engaged in the world's oldest profession. Under the Americans, these women pursued higher education, wrote radical treatises, organized associations, and campaigned for suffrage. And during the post colonial period, they became Amazons in the popular press, joined the Communist Party, and challenged martial law. In recent times, women continue to disrupt Duterte's drug wars, and in the midst of the pandemic, focus on protecting and sustaining their families and communities. So, this lecture is dedicated to the Filipinas who disrupted and continue to disrupt convention and the power structure in the Philippines to reclaim their own identity and place in history. So, I will discuss female disruptors in history as my title says, focusing on a few Hook Amazons. Indeed, I'm very excited to talk to all of you about these Filipina disruptors, culminating in the end in a brief discussion on what we all hope will be another Filipina disruptor in the coming elections. Why not, right? So let me just share my screen right now in terms of my, you guys can see it. Is that okay? Good. So you already know me. So I can go. As this lecture series postulate, Philippine history is full of disruptions and reclamations. Perhaps the most famous characterization, the most famous characterization of Philippine history is that this is a story of a people who spent 300 years trapped in a convent and then shaped by Hollywood for the next 50 years, right? I mean, everybody knows this metaphor and this quotable quote, as we said. This popular maxim has been used to describe our history. As one Philippine Inquirer journalist wrote, 300 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood. This roughly sums up our colonial history. And sometimes it's even been used to talk about some of our cultural practices, including food. Like one travel magazine wrote, 300 years in a convent, 50 years in Hollywood. This pretty much sums up our, our Filipino culture and cuisine. Their fusion of regional and cultural specialties, along with old and new influences, results in delicious lechon, chicharon, and even lumpia. I'm not sure about those examples, especially when you think about lumpia coming from the Chinese. But I guess this detail doesn't really matter. Stanley Carno, in his famous book *In Our Image: America's Empire in the Philippines*, also used this phrase partly to explain the failure of U.S. democratic experiment in the country. Because for many, this quotable quote explains the hybridity or the crisis in Filipino identity. Imagine being trapped in the convent for 300 years and then being rescued and seduced by Hollywood. This quote has been very controversial, especially with regards to its origin. Who actually said it, right? Some said that it came from Teodoro Agoncillo, pioneering nationalist historian of the Philippines, or to Nick Joaquin, the famous writer and national artist. But perhaps the most convincing argument is the one that attributes this quote to Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, a famous Filipino journalist, public historian, and writer. Since this was an utterance that was not written, the phrase 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood has now achieved a life of its own. It has several iterations. One of the most popular is 300 years in the convent, 50 years in Hollywood, and 3 years in a Japanese prison camp. Or during the regime of Ferdinand and Melda Marcos, the oft-quoted saying was 300 years in a Spanish convent, 50 years of Hollywood, and 20 years of his and hers. The controversy of whether this quote came from a woman or a man is interesting. Because if there's one thing that this quote describes, and this is what I argue, but not readily mentioned, is that it is a gendered characterization of Philippine history and identity. 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood, such gendered characterizations often explain the Filipino or Filipinas' ambiguous and contrasting identities. Spanish colonization produced devout Filipino Catholics steeped in the virtues of charity, obedience, and chastity, but the glitz of Hollywood made Filipinas adventurous, daring, and sexually liberated. Although referring to the Filipino sense of history and identity, such metaphors distinctly refer to women of the Philippines, as they were the ones often portrayed in history and literary books as pious convent girls who were transformed to Americanized modernized women. So this talk, actually part of this talk, when I talk about female disruptors, is also to challenge such characterizations and indeed question the gendering of Philippine history and identity. I will attempt to demonstrate that by placing women at the center of historical inquiry, this metaphor begins to unravel, and far from being trapped in convents during the Spanish colonial period, as I previously mentioned, women were educated and worked. Under the Americans, women became much more politically active. The convent and the Hollywood and the values they promoted were used primarily to misrepresent women and portray their passivity and helplessness under colonization. Thus, my focus on Filipina disruptors, those who refuse to be trapped in the convent or uncritically accept American cultural values. In fact, they challenge gender and social conventions that took our history in interesting and liberating ways. So I won't really, so part of my recent work is actually trying to understand, the characterization of our history like that and why it's gendered. But I really wouldn't want to go into all of that in this talk. But I feel that, in terms, I argue that the roots of such mischaracterizations actually is because of the textbooks that we grew up in, which were produced mostly by male historians, which promoted such gendered images and metaphors to feminize Filipinos and their history. And much of this historiography generally neglected women and relegated them to the margins of history. Their treatment of women, for example, during the Spanish period, relied upon Jose Rizal's problematic female characters in his two famous novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. Only women live in the convents and blindly embrace the values promoted by Catholicism. And of course, but this has been challenged. In fact, the most recent article by Caroline Howe really looked much more deeply into the whole metaphors of women, especially Maria Clara in the works of Rizal. But I won't go too much into that. But But suffice it to say that, that many of our textbooks actually promote such gendered characterizations. And also during the American period, while women vigorously entered the political scene during the American colonial period, male dominated histories primarily focused on the masculinized political machinations by an all male ensemble of Filipino collaborators and nationalists. So the historiography of the politics of Philippine Commonwealth rarely invoked the glamour of Hollywood, and yet we kept on talking about this, being 50 years in Hollywood. So the legacy of the double metaphor of the convent and Hollywood continued to misrepresent and marginalize women in Philippine history. Thus, my focus on Filipina disruptors, as I said, those who challenge these metaphors and also to offer a different metaphor in order to imagine a history of the Philippines outside of the convent and a rejection of Hollywood, those who disrupted not just these metaphors, but Philippine history itself. So again, I actually have a long lecture, but I'm not going to say all that. But then, so there's a very strong literature about women prior to the colonial period. Women in the Philippines, Southeast Asia, they enjoyed a high level of autonomy and economic importance. So what I'm doing now is to kind of go back into history and to kind of see the different female disruptors in many parts of our history, right? So even prior to colonial rule, we know that women already played a very important role in society, and there was no they enjoyed a high level of autonomy and economic importance. The most important is that the cultural and religious significance of women's reproductive role gave them magical and ritual powers as shamans or babaylans in the Philippines. And that is really a kind of um, encapsulates the power that they had in pre-colonial society. Okay, so from convent to Hollywood, the changing role Filipinas. So the first metaphor describing Filipinos as being kept for 300 years in the convent is a simplified characterization of the Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines that began in earnest in 1565 and lasted until 1896. Most of the classic works in Philippine history treat Spanish colonization in the Philippines as a successful enterprise where Catholic missionaries converted almost 80% of the native population within the first 100 years. The next 100 years saw the efflorescence of this new religion with hundreds of Bibles and prayer books published for the public, catechism lessons offered in schools and parishes, and the shortage of religious personnel only meant a greater demand for the administering of sacraments from baptism, communion, marriage, and confession to the devout Filipino converts. So we all know that this whole process of Hispanization, right? This with the adoption of this new religion, where Spanish and Catholic customs and beliefs from deference to elders and authority in service to the church were promoted, while lifestyles were altered, concluding the practice of monogamous marriages, the end of divorce and premarital sex, and the promotion of values such as obedience, charity, and devotion. But actually, it wasn't this idea that the Filipinos enthusiastically embraced this religion and all its cultural values have been challenged by many historians. Foremost among them is Caroline Brewer, who argues that far from a peaceful and enthusiastic acceptance of this new religion and lifestyle, what occurred in the Philippines was in fact a holy confrontation where two belief systems, shamanism and Catholicism, directly clash over belief and lifestyle issues. And this confrontation directly affected women, whose traditional power as indigenous leaders, healers, priests, and shamans were delegitimized and marginalized by the Catholic Church and priests. And not only shamans were attacked, but the entire essence and nature of womanhood was put into question by this new religion because it promoted different standards and morals for men and women. Women were encouraged to internalize the moral teaching that they were evil by nature, while men were able to separate sin from their essential selves and blame women as the causal agent of sin. With Catholicism, women underwent a process of negation, reversal, and betrayal, which had a considerable impact on women's self perception and how they were perceived. But as Brewer herself shows, women did not entirely disappear. In fact, what they accomplished was to find a space where the two systems of cultural knowledge and mechanisms of transfer existed side by side, where there was an outwardly process of Catholic practice coexisting with indigenous practices, right? So, so basically, what I'm saying is that women's role in society, of course, they were forever changed by Spanish colonialism, but then and especially in terms of how the Spanish educated and formed or transformed these women, right? For example, in terms of education, the Spanish did not really believe in co-education. They offered two kinds of secondary education for girls: boarding schools for Spanish girls and exclusive colegios for the daughters of upper class Spaniards in the Beaterias. The Beaterias were convents open to native and pious women affiliated with the religious orders, and these religious institutions houses for women devoted to lifestyles of piety, poverty, and chastity, right? So, and all this this education, they also it was the education of women were not only confined to the schools, but also in terms of printed matter. During that point, especially as many of historians in the room would know, the existence, for example, of rule books were so crucial. So these are the schools for girls in the Spanish Philippines, by the way, the boarding schools, the beaterios. I couldn't really go through all of them, but they also became, so on the one hand, they were institutions who transformed these women and essentially, you know, um, influence them or shape them with the cultural or with the Catholic values that I just talked about, like charity, piety, and devotion and all that. But also, it all planted the seeds of certain resistance of these women, which I will talk about later, right? So anyway, so this Beaterius, but aside from the education, as I said, a lot of the cultural values that were promoted for women were also promoted by these rule books, right? So these rule books were courtesy books. We all know that, courtesy books, training and etiquette books in the Philippines, they became popular in the 19th century, and they promoted good conduct with Catholic morality. So it's closely related to various literary forms, and they concern itself with the mundane, the moral and behavioral questions that arise in the common day-to-day course of human life. Most of the rule books, however, were written by men, but they concerned primarily with the conduct of women. Thus, they were codifications of male ideas about concerning the public and private conduct of women. Such rule books demonstrate a binary in the representations of these women, as I would say here, like they're which one is a good woman and which one is a bad woman, right? And of course, when we think about the Catholic values or the virtues that they promoted, we know that the good women are usually women of virtue, values modesty, humility, etc. And the bad women are, women who are much more aggressive or assertive and are not following this path that the rule books prescribe, right? So in many ways, the cultural life of women under the Spanish period promoted in their limited schooling and in the rule books involved the glorification of the silent or silenced women as well-mannered and moral, and the marginalization of dissident women as ill-mannered or downright evil. The effects of these cultural practices placed women firmly in the margins and isolated them in public life and kept them in the home, school, and the convent. But despite the institutional limitations placed on women, women found a way to engage directly in the public sphere. Perhaps the most significant interventions in the public sphere were the ones, as Professor Maluca Magay wrote about the working women of Manila of the 19th century, because they found occupations as cigareras, criadas, tenderas, vendedoras, casureras, bordadoras, maestras, and mujeres publicas, or the prostitutes, right? So whether they pursued occupations out of economic need or form empowerment, women workers of the 19th century changed the social fabric of Philippine society, especially in the cities, and of course, disrupted society and disrupted the types of, like codifications of femininity that were promoted by the schools, by the churches, and the rule books. And of course, the burgeoning of the national ideas and movements. So these are some images of the working women of Manila of the 19th century. So, the burgeoning of nationalist ideas and movements in the 19th century paved the way for women to assume overtly political roles in society. Indeed, female revolutionaries became part of the nationalist imagination, playing a role in anti colonial struggle against the Spanish government. Female shamans and healers, as this you can see in this image, the babaylans of the pre-colonial Philippines, whose power was undermined by the Catholic Church, were never integrated into colonial society and survived within messianic organizations that tried to preserve their central and uncontested spiritual role, especially in peasant societies. The dominant image of the female warrior in the 18th and 19th centuries was embodied by Gabriela Silang, as we all know, a female general who assumed control of her husband's revolutionary army after he was slain by the Spanish. Gabriela, as we see her in many images, she rode horses, wielded bolos and spears, and led attacks against the Spanish, but was eventually arrested and publicly hanged as punishment for crimes against the state and the essence of femininity. Women also played a role in the Katipunan, which recognized the indispensability of women in the struggle against Spain and acknowledged their rights and privileges, but largely excluded from the Revolutionary Army. But prominent women who were part of the Katipunan, like Tandang Sora, who took care of the rebels, Trinidad Texon, who procured arms for the revolution, Agreda Kahabagan, a freedom fighter and soldier from Batangas, and Teresa Magbanwa, reputed to be the first woman from Visayas to join the revolution. Gregoria de Jesus, the wife of Katipunan founder Andres Bonifacio, was said to be constantly at his side even in battle. So several historians have argued that the Katipunan and the Philippine Revolution opened the door for Filipino women to engage in political and revolutionary affairs, and in recent years, feminist historians have rescued these women from obscurity and restored them to nationalist narratives of the revolution. It is very clear that women were safely out of the convent by the end of the Spanish rule, and in fact disrupted cultural values that confined them inside this institution. And of course, in 1898, the Philippines became formally acquired by the US after the Spanish American War, even after the Philippine American War, which killed hundreds of American soldiers and almost 500,000 Filipino soldiers. And the end of the war in 1902, then Americans pursued a program of tutelary and oppressive colonialism within the next 50 years. And in fact, so while it's true, so the Americans did promote public education, right? But it was and also the integration to this new kind of modern society that the Americans promoted, and as I said earlier, was this kind of lure of Hollywood, right? So the introduction of modern values, which about glamour and consumerism and all the public images, right? So images of women in Hollywood then pervaded a lot of the media during this period, which was specifically targeted for women. But so again, so there was also an effort in order to have this type of woman that was like as a consumerist, right, where they are also empowered, but definitely also subscribing to a particular type of modern woman that was invoked by this image of Hollywood. But of course, again, in this period of our history, women disrupted this narrative, right? So, because in the 1920s and 1930s, women, particularly women, energized the political scene by campaigning for suffrage, and American efforts led to an expansion of public education, right? So, while a lot of women did go to schools at this time, more than during the Spanish period, but only few obtained college degrees, but still education opened up new employment opportunities for women, and yet many areas of public life remained exclusively male. Although women occupied positions within the colonial bureaucracy, they were restricted to its lowest ranks, while, and of course, most significantly, Filipinas were not allowed to vote, and for the most part, the colonial state resisted extending political power to women. But as more and more women came to share public space with men, issues of female political representation became crucial within Philippine society, and middle class women began to question their exclusion from public debate and the denial of their right to vote. Right? It was, of course, the vote was also limited even to men, but the fact that women were becoming more educated, they were also, have more employment, right? But still, the government and the society then still tried to protect male monopoly over political power by limiting women's participation in public life to the classroom, charitable institutions, and voluntary organizations. So this exclusion actually inspired a group of upper class Filipinas, which one UP historian Mergros Tirona calls the Panuelo activists, right? Including Pura Villanueva Calao, Encarnacion Alzona, Paz Mendoza Guanzon, Jose Vallanes Escoda, Natividad Almeida Lopez, Maria Ventura, Concepcion Felix Rodriguez, and Pilar Hidalgo Lim to demand suffrage and create the most important women's movement in the early 20th century. The women's organizations that they established initially waged campaigns for women's rights, such as addressing issues as family health, support for child rearing, and better conditions for working women, including maternity leave. But these campaigns gradually became more overtly political as women's associations, social clubs recruited members, undertook advocacy work, and coordinated nationwide efforts to enfranchise the Filipina. And all this created a lively debate. And, for many of you who are historians, you know that to prepare for eventual independence, a constitutional convention was held, which really renewed the debate for and against women's suffrage. At this crucial juncture, as the country was preparing independence and drafting a constitution, different groups in society competed to define the relationship between the new nation and Filipino women. According to Mina Rosses, the public hearings featuring suffragists revealed sharp conflicts about citizenship and nationalism. At the center of the suffrage debates was the broader issue of which cultural construction of the feminine and Filipino women should be endorsed in the new nation. Should Filipinas be Spanish influenced, that is, pious, religious women confined to the domestic sphere, or Americanized, English speaking, university educated, and professional with the right to vote? By engaging in these debates and campaigning for suffrage rights, women in the Philippines stretched the limits of female citizenship beyond the boundaries of family life for the first time. So again, a major disruption, right? So creating another major disruption in the political sphere by campaigning for suffrage and also being part of a definition of a citizen, right? So a citizen that includes women and women being active in politics. So, but of course, it caused a lot of rift in society. And in fact, the women, the men, especially the female male leaders, they felt that giving women suffrage would lead to the neglect and detriment of the husband, children, and household. It will drain public finances. It would lead to divorce and destroy the moral fiber of Philippine society. Even the press was vitriolic in terms of its opposition to women's suffrage and called for women to concentrate on social work and abandon their preoccupation with politics. But Filipinos were unfazed, and again, they became disruptors of the status quo, right? So the debates themselves unwittingly recognized the critical leadership role that women play in the national arena. And by the end of 1936, they were campaigning, and then a referendum was held. In the referendum, women were eligible voters were asked whether they're for or against suffrage, and the women really campaigned. A lot of women's organizations and associations really campaigned in order for women to say yes on plebiscite day. And on the day, on plebiscite day, about 90% of eligible voters actually said yes to suffrage, and that really began the female suffrage. And Quezon himself said that I've always been and I will always support the vote for women, right? So they did have support, but it's actually the women's efforts that lead to to suffrage. By campaigning for and gaining suffrage, elite Filipinas not only effectively expanded their political role, but also declared that they were major participants in the process of nation building. Their participation in the political arena seemed irreversible, and they assumed they would never again be marginalized in Philippine political life. So the Spanish and American colonial appearance led to transformations and disruptions. After the establishment of the Commonwealth period, the Philippines faced another major disruption, the Japanese occupation and World War II. It is within this context and the period after on the establishment of the new independent Philippine Republic that we encounter more Filipina disruptors, the Hook Amazons. So that period of 1941 to 1945, these are just some images of the Pacific War and the Japanese occupation. But what I really wanted to focus on, at least to focus on the Hook Amazons, or this now who also disrupted the society and societal values during the Japanese War or the Japanese occupation and the period after. So the Hook Rebellion, for those of you who are not aware, it has two phases really. The first stage is the establishment of the Hukbo ng Bayan Laban sa Hapon, which was established during the Japanese occupation as a major guerrilla resistance movement against the Japanese. It was established in March 1942. It was initiated by leaders of peasant organizations and the leadership by the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, or the old Communist Party. So the defeat of the Japanese ended this first phase of the Hook guerrilla movement. And for a time, the Hook rebels were actually wanted to work with the Philippine government, but then they soon realized that the government was still very much controlled by the Americans at this point. And both the Philippine government and the Americans, especially in the period of the Cold War, they were determined not to let the left establish a political power base in society, right? So basically, especially because of the Cold War, the heroes of the war, the Hooks who were war heroes, then became the the godless atheist communists during after the war, right? So they were trained, they were transformed from being war heroes to traitors of the nation, right? So by August 1945, the Hooks had been forced by political repression to go underground, and its peasant members, especially reorganized in the forests of Luzon to launch a massive resistance movement against the government, and this time under the name Hukbong Mapagpalayan ng Bayan, HMB, which also, and they still continue to call themselves the Hooks. So the Hooks, at its peak, they probably have about 15,000 members, but then they were supported by an even larger number of non-combatant peasant supporters. But they were very successful in capturing villages, driving out landlords, and sometimes redistributing land among the tenants, while at the same time launching the successful surprise attacks against the Philippine constabulary. But certain problems, both external and internal, affected the strength of the movement and in fact the morale within the movement. So that's why by the mid 1950s the movement was in decline, partly because of the US and the Philippines counterinsurgency efforts, and the presidency of Ramon Magsaysay and all that. So really with the surrender of the leaders and followers of the Hook movement in the late 50s, the phase of the peasant revolution ended in the Philippines. So the Hook Rebellion was the most important peasant movement in Philippine history. It's the most successful resistance army in Asia during World War II and the first major communist rebellion defeated by U.S. counterinsurgency operations at the height of the Cold War. But the Hooks were important for another lesser known reason. Theirs was the first major political and military organization in the country to include and actively recruit women. Women played a central role in the Hook Rebellion, and a significant number of Filipino women, mostly from peasant backgrounds, abandoned their traditional roles in Philippine society to participate in the struggle. Although it's impossible to determine the exact number of women, in the movement, but you can but at least an estimate would be about 1 in 10 men. So it's about 1,000 to 1,500 women were part of the movement, but these are the active members. But of course, there are more peasant supporters who stayed in the barrios. And these women warriors learned their communist catechism. They were trained as soldiers and spies, drilled in the use of weapons, and became highly skilled in the arts of war. At the same time, they fell in love with men alongside whom they fought, and in many cases they became pregnant, gave birth, and raised families amid the turmoil of the revolution. These women existed in two worlds, a world of war and a world of love, and they struggled constantly to satisfy and reconcile their personal desire for love and an effective family life with the larger impersonal and collective aims of the revolutionary Hook movement. So, in many ways, they were disruptors in every sense. They disrupted the war effort of the Japanese. They also disrupted the Republic and Philippine society after the war. They disrupted societal values about the proper role of women, and within the organization itself, they disrupted the the usual conventions of running a revolutionary organization. So this is the where the hooks are. I just gave you the background of the Hook Rebellion here. So, and that actually, for me, became my inspiration for writing this book on the Hook Amazons because they were very important in terms of the guerrilla resistance during the war and after, but there was not a lot of information about them, right? So these women's stories remain untold, and that for me was my inspiration to write my book on the Amazons of the Hope Rebellion. This is the US version, and this is the Philippine version. But actually, if you, for those of you who are old enough, you would know that this is not an actual hook, but it's an image from a movie called Guerrilleras of the actress Carmen Rosales playing a guerrillera. So anyway, so for my book, I drew on interviews with women who participated in the Hope Rebellion. So in order to show how both political and personal factors led women to join this revolutionary movement. So this is the newspaper, the cover of the Philippines Free Press, where the cover of my book was based from, but it is from this movie, Galleria. Hold on. So the Hook Amazons were women who were mostly peasants and some middle class women who they joined the rebellion, and they earned a fearsome reputation in the press and in the popular culture as Hook Amazon. These women served with men in the Hook movement, mostly as part of support committees with roles as organizers, educators, propaganda workers, and couriers. Some women became part of the military and political hierarchy, with about 5 women emerging as military commanders, and one woman, Celia Mariana Pomeroy, became a member of the Politburo. And these women balanced their personal desires, as I said, love, relationships, marriages, and children, with the political aims of the revolution. So in a way, they really encapsulated what we always hear in terms of the personal is political, the political is personal. They were a major part of the rebellion, but they still don't have the recognition that they deserve. Although I'm happy to say that I feel like there's a lot more awareness about the Hook Amazons, not primarily just because of my book, but then I think it has somehow permeated into our history of World War II and after. So capturing the Hook Amazons is really one of the major um, things that preoccupy the government after the war. So these are just some images of the Philippine constabulary capturing these women hooks. Okay, so let me just kind of, and then, so this is very interesting. This woman hook, Leonora, um, via, basically, oh no, Leonora Hipas, she surrendered, but after she surrendered, so she looks very much like a hook woman warrior, right? But then when she surrendered, she said that she also wanted to get married and all that. So then you have this kind of just position between a woman warrior and a woman in love, and it kind of, for me, those images kind of encapsulate what I was talking about, how they existed in the world of war, right, and in the world of love. So, but one of the things that I wanted to maybe talk about, that I really want to talk about, are, and to zero in, is the women warriors, or women who became women commanders, right? And one woman who became part of the Politburo. So Hook women as warriors, it's still very rare in the movement to really have female military commanders. And there is a mythology surrounding the first major military commander named Dayang Dayang, and female military commanders in the Hook movement. So Dayang Dayang was actually the first major military commander of the movement. She launched these attacks against Japanese, very successful. And then she was one of the first ones to be were part of the military committee of the Hukbalahap, who established the Hukbalahap. But then eventually they said that she became abusive of her power, and in fact she was punished and executed by the Huk leadership herself, because she basically broke the trust, they said. According to, of course, by the time I interviewed this women, she was no longer with us. So we hear all these stories about dying, but what's that she abused her power, right? And really broke the trust of the people that she was supposed to be serving. But what's so interesting about dying is that the way that they always describe dying is that she's this very, masculine in appearance and her demeanor. And that even Luis Taruk, who was the supremo of the movement, basically said that men were scared of her because she acted like a man, you know. So and the fact that she acted like a man is the fact, because she has this very masculine demeanor, right? And men were scared of her, which was very interesting in terms of um, understanding how these women became military commanders. So the physical appearance of women was very important in terms of understanding why they became part of the Hope movement, right? And this also reflected with the arrest of another Hook woman. This is Simeona Ponsalan, or Commander Guerrero. And when she was arrested, the newspapers actually hailed her arrest and said that, this is our 6-foot Amazon. And again, she was described by many in the movement as, somebody who's masculine in appearance, who doesn't like wearing female, who only likes to play with boys, and very tomboyish, right? Which is even the way she describes herself. So when I asked Commander Guerrero, why do you think you became a military commander? She would say it's because of, I've never really liked, just doing girly stuff, right? And in fact, I I've always seen myself as one of the boys, right? So the rise of these women commanders highlights the role of gender in the Hope movement, because as I said, dying itself, we don't know anything much about her except that she was seen as very very masculine in appearance, because like a real man she feared nothing, according to Luis Taruk. And also Guerrero, she described herself that. And the fact that both Dayang and Guerrero were seen as sexually ambiguous perpetuates the belief that women with masculine traits could become military commanders in revolutionary organizations. This reality somehow reinforces the patriarchal structure of the Hope organization. Since men were the ones who led and carried guns in the movement, it was permissible that women, as long as they looked like men, become commanders. So in the end, these women, since they possessed the same traits as the men, did not challenge the dominant ideology in the movement. Men or masculine looking men were still the warriors to protect the women. Indeed, in memoirs and conversations with other hooks, the masculine demeanors of these female commanders seem to explain their role as military leaders. So within this context, Liwaywai's accession as a commander becomes all the more interesting because at the time of her arrest, she was she has she was featured in many newspaper magazines, right? And magazines. And she was described as a pretty high school senior, many times a queen in town festivities. She became an instant celebrity, as this magazine, one of the reporters wrote this. In the hands of her captors, Liwaywai is being given the attention that befits a heroine. She has her own room, her bed, chairs for her callers, and is accessible to all and any of her relatives any time of the day. In the military police command headquarters, she's even referred to as the Joan of Arc of the Philippines, and this said not in derision or mockery now that one of the most influential enemy of the MPC is their captive. As the reference to Joan of Arc revealed, the attraction to Luwaywai was a response not just to her beauty, but to her identity as a daring female military commander who had established a reputation leading successful military attacks against the Japanese during World War II. Right? So basically, her descriptions of her was so different from the descriptions of Dying and Commander Guerrero, right? Because she's always seen that she was this queen, former beauty queen, but at the same time, she was being feted by the media. The government also alleged that she had that she was guilty of rebellion, sedition, and insurrection. So Liwaywai's treatment as both a dangerous enemy of the state and a former beauty queen who was given all the treatment befitting a society star underscored the sense of ambivalence and uncertainty that surrounded the public representation of female warriors like Liwaywai in Philippine society during the late 1940s. So how did, and I quote from a newspaper, pretty woman, soft-spoken and fond of stylish clothes, perfume, and dancing like Liwaywai can emerge as an important military commander remains an enigma. In fact, she was reputed to have always combed her hair, manicured and polished her nails, and applied makeup and lipstick right before her encounters. And Commander Liwaywai herself admits to the veracity of the stories, explaining that when the guerrillas under her command saw her well groomed and wearing lipstick, they would initially gain confidence, convinced that their commander appeared fearless and poised. She said that she'd like to also look pretty when she died in the encounters, right? So but in the end, seriously, she said, I'm fighting for the right to be myself. So how did she become a military commander? Right? So in fact, one of newspapers said that the YY came from, like was transformed from being a a queening in barrio festivals to that of a guerrilla squadron commander. And the only explanation, or at least the explanation that she gave us was, you know, she was she grew up in Pampanga. Her father was a well-known and a well-loved leader, who was a vice mayor and then mayor. And during the Japanese occupation, her father right away called for resistance against the Japanese. So the Japanese captured him, tortured him, and mercilessly, really killed him and murdered him, and in fact displayed his body, as a sign for those who would resist the Japanese. So it was at that point when Liwaywai herself was transformed. So at first she thought she did not want to really be, to be joining the guerrillas in the mountains. But after what she felt, what happened to her father, then she felt that she really did not have any choice but to join the resistance movement. A journalist's account of Liwaywai's capture supports this explanation. The signal for a drastic change in the life of Liwaywai from queening and Bari festivals to that of a guerrilla squadron commander was sounded when the savage enemy stepped arrogantly on central Luzon soil and got her father, Basilio Gomez, who refused to cooperate with the Japanese, imprisoned him, maltreated him, and paraded him in many plazas as an example to those who refused to work for the Japanese until the life in that robust manhood was snapped out. In fact, one of Liwaywai's heartbreaks was not even able to get the body of her father after he was killed by the Japanese. So by becoming a commander, did Liwaywai seek to restore her father's lost masculinity? So again, the promotion of Liwaywai highlighted the internal contradictions within the Hope organization, and the explanations offered for it revealed the apprehension of her male comrades. So Liwaywai actually was chosen to be a military commander, and at that point, she really did not refuse, because she felt that this was the only way for her to revenge her father's death, right? So her feelings of revenge and her embrace of bravery actually, in the Hook ideology, those are still masculine virtues, and that partially explains why she was promoted as a commander, because in a way it was, her being a commander was a way of regaining the masculinity that was lost by the death of her father, right? So just like just like um, Dying Dayang and Guerrero, the Liwaywai's feelings of revenge and bravery, as I mentioned, were part of the Hope gender ideology, and that somehow justified her promotion as a commander. So, anyway, so the portrayal of the Amazon also in the press, reflects many of this kind of internal contradictions. In order to justify the arrest, for example, of women, they needed to be seen as men, but in order to elicit sympathy and understanding of those Amazons who were captured, they needed to be portrayed as ambiguous. While they dressed like men, they were still very feminine inside, right? So this whole Hook organization promoted all these different um I said, did you just write that, Kristen? Yes. Okay. So no, you did not. So anyway, I don't have that much time, but I also wanted to introduce you to another, Hook Amazon who disrupted, in a way, a major disruptor too of the Hook movement, and this is Celia Mariana Pomeroy. So Celia Mariana Pomeroy was the only woman who was elected to be part of the political bureau of the Hook movement, and she was a well-educated woman. She finished at the University of the Philippines, and she was actually um had was had this transition or political education, and she was nurtured by her male comrades, right? Because from the very beginning they already saw that she was a very committed um activist, right? And a committed activist who eventually became part of the Communist Party and eventually became a Hook woman, and then also joined the rebellion after the war. But Celia, the most important thing about Celia was that she was always very concerned about women's issues. So from the beginning, she was much more concerned about, about the social injustice. So in fact, she always looked at the struggle of the Hooks, not just against the Japanese, but actually the struggle of the Hooks were against also injustice, social injustice in society, about inequality, and about corruption. And eventually, she also realized in her involvement that she's also fighting against the oppression of women. So, and Celia, I mean, her rise is really quite interesting. I mean, I don't have much time to really talk about that. In fact, She was arrested here with Bill Pomeroy. Bill Pomeroy is a major intellectual of the movement also, and Celia was right up there, as one of the major intellectuals of the movement. And again, this is something so unusual, for women, but in a way, it was also very understandable because of her level of education, and the fact that she always felt like she was equal in terms of having all these political discussions with men. So she started being a communist, and then in the end she also became a feminist, right? I mean, she believed in the communist cause from the very beginning because she felt that this is the only movement that would get rid of poverty and inequality in the Philippines. And then she realized that many of the cultural values that um that um that basically affected not just the poor but also women in the Philippines were reproduced in the movement, especially in terms of the sexual relations in the movement, which unfortunately I don't have much time to talk about. But there was a sex problem in the movement, but because of men having relationships with women in the movement, I can talk about it more during the question and answer. But basically, Celia was one of the first women on the pondering about the sex problem in the movement, but also the issue of just the sexual oppression of women in general society. Okay, so I don't have much time, so I'm just going to conclude, right? So for Celia, the problems of sex and gender in the movement is really the roots of the problems, not just lies in the movement, but in the feudal and capitalist mentality because of the feudal and capitalist society of where the Philippines of the Philippines, right? That also shaped the attitudes of cadres. So unfortunately, cadres suffered from the same moral double standard of bourgeois society, where a man was always, lauded for his adventures, right? While women have always been looked down upon. For Celia, this attitude about, like not just in terms of sexuality, but in general about the discrimination against women, and or the women question that she began to articulate was very much rooted also in the patriarchal society, right? So really, as I said, in the end she was not only a committed communist but also a feminist. So Celia's transformation was not unique in the Hook movement. Most women were transformed by the experiences as Hook guerrillas from World War II. So women were played the central role in the movement. So there war was a major disruption in the normal life of the Filipinos who were then preparing for the independence, and yet the Hooks reclaimed their country by organizing the resistance against these new invaders. And women further disrupted the usual conventions in running a revolutionary organization in order to reclaim their femininity, but most importantly, their essential role in fighting for liberation and social justice. So almost all the women who are part of the Hook Balahap or the Hook movement believed that their lives were enriched by their revolutionary experience. By becoming Hooks, they had learned to play new and significant roles beyond the boundaries of their homes and villages, and for many, this was just a start of a lifelong engagement with Philippine politics. The Hook women left a legacy for female revolutionaries in Philippine history. This was just the beginning, as we witnessed ourselves, women became more politicized, radicalized, and militarized during the period of martial law and beyond. More women, many of them educated from Manila and experienced political activists and organizers outside of Manila, joined the above ground and underground organizations affiliated with the new Communist Party of the Philippines established in 1968. These women who joined the New People's Army, the CPP, labor unions, peasant organizations, political parties, and feminist movements such as Gabriela continued to disrupt Philippine politics and society. While I focus on the Hook women, what I have tried to show in this lecture is that Filipino women have been causing major disruptions in Philippine history. And this is a good thing. Indeed, as this brief exploration shows, far from being stuck in the convent or blinded by the glamour of Hollywood, women in the Philippines were active in shaping their own destinies and indeed the destinies of their nation. While institutional factors tried to keep them inside the home and limited their roles in public, they found a place and space to explore, to work, to struggle, and to exist away from the convent and Hollywood. We found them in the convents and churches as they both strengthened and challenged religious mores. We found them in schools as they educated themselves and pursued professions. We found them in the streets of Manila, in the halls of Congress, clamoring for suffrage. And we found them in central Luzon, carrying guns, fighting the Japanese, and continuing to struggle for independence after the war. In contemporary times, we find them in much bigger numbers in schools, offices, factories, farms, as members and leaders of political parties, organizations, and in the underground. We also find them outside of the Philippines as they migrated to all corners of the world, pursuing higher education, working in hospitals as doctors and nurses, dominating and shaping the domestic industries, caring for children and their elderly, and rebuilding and sustaining the communities of their native and adopted countries. We found them in the highest positions in the country as political leaders, government secretaries, congresswomen, senators, and presidents. We have already produced two female presidents, more than the US or any other Western nation, President Aquino and GMA. And we have another chance to again place another female disruptor during the upcoming presidential elections, which is only 3 weeks away. I think Leni Robredo has disrupted the election somehow by being the only female candidate, but has proven herself time and time again that she could not only play with the boys, but in fact emerge as the most competent, most trustworthy, most compassionate, and has the most detailed vision and plan for the Philippines. So for the past 6 years, the country has been in darkness with the incompetent murderous administration, which only brought more poverty, injustice, and deaths in the country. In the middle of it all, we had faced and was still facing a pandemic. The coronavirus is still with us, but this disease was aggravated by the spread of misinformation and lies, and one that exploits people's insecurities and distrust in government. Amidst the highly contentious presidential elections in the Philippines, there are several groups and movements who aim to rewrite the past and to discredit those who believe in the historical truths, right? That in fact, our justice system has failed us, and then now we have, potential president who tries to rewrite history, right? And try to have to disrespect all our ideas about accountability and responsibility, and of course historical truth. So thus we probably need another woman to disrupt this pattern of deception and destruction, and therefore reclaim our sense of history, decency, responsibility, and accountability. And as often quoted, the best man to do the job, to disrupt and to reclaim, is a woman. So hopefully, whoever we choose for our leaders in the coming elections we will continue the legacy of these Filipina disruptors.